fantastic. So again, a huge welcome to all of you joining us for this session on food poverty and food waste. I think this is something that we've all become a lot more aware of, not just over the last couple of years, but actually as we've gone through coronavirus, and now winter is approaching, and we know that actually people are still really struggling with food poverty. Reliance on food banks is likely to get much higher over the next couple of months. And we also know at the same time that people are struggling to get food. As a society, we also waste a lot of food. So today we're going to be hearing from our panellists about food poverty in the UK, what they're doing about it, but also what we can do about it, and see actually how we can try and find a way through this together. So I'm just going to quickly introduce you to our participants, and then I'm going to ask them just to say a little bit about themselves. So a huge welcome to our speakers today. We're joined by Tessa Clarke, who's the co-founder and CEO of Olio, Jany Byam Shaw, who is a trustee of the Felix Project, Emma Thorogood from the Trussell Trust, Crummie, who is the co-founder of Too Good To Go, and Chloe Hall, who's the co-founder of Furloughed Foodies. So fantastic range of organisations that are involved in food sharing, food support, and food banks, as well as tackling food waste. So perhaps if we could hand over to you first, Tessa, and then we'll hear from the others. Just tell us a little bit about you and your organisations. Tell us about what you do.
Lovely to be here. So Olio is an app that exists to tackle the problem of food waste, and specifically food waste in the home. And so how it works is you simply snap a photo of any spare food you might have, you add it to the app, neighbours living nearby can get an alert, they can browse the listings, request what they want and pop round and pick it up. We've had 2.5 million people join us, and together they have shared over 9 million portions of food.
Brilliant, that's a fantastic idea. Thank you so much for joining us. Jane, do you want to tell us a little bit about you and about the Felix Project?
Yes, we're a fairly new charity based in London. So we opened our doors in 2016. Like most charities, we'd like to go out of business eventually. We want to end food waste and end food poverty in London. We have, for every pound that we spend, we are able to deliver about £12 worth of food to charities, really good causes. We can only do this because we're supported by amazing volunteers who give their time for free, by companies, philanthropists, individual donors, and also donations in kind by people like Renault. And really, above all, by food suppliers who are making fantastic efforts to get really good food to us. It's food that is surplus and at risk of going to waste. And we get this good food to good causes.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jane. We're really pleased to have you. Let's go to Jamie. Jamie, do you want to tell us a little bit about you and Too Good To Go?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks so much for inviting us. It's fantastic to be in such great company with some amazing organizations. So yeah, I'm Jany Crummie, one of the co-founders of Too Good To Go, which is a social impact company fighting food waste. And we're a B Corp, which just sort of means we're a business which is doing good for the world. People typically know us through our mobile app, which is essentially a marketplace for surplus food. So we connect consumers with businesses who have surplus food for sale, so food that would otherwise go to waste. It operates really simply. Users simply log on to the Too Good To Go app, and they'll see a host of participating businesses, and they purchase what we refer to as a magic bag. This is something, and this whole sort of way of rescuing food is what we like to call like a win-win-win. It's a win for businesses who are able to recover sunk costs, a win for consumers who get to discover sort of amazing food, and ultimately a win for the planet, so no food is going to waste. So that is what people typically know us for, but this allows us to fund what we call our movement around food waste, which is the work that we do with schools, with businesses, households, and work that we do in public affairs to try and spark some policy change around food waste. So in a nutshell, that is us in Too Good To Go.
Brilliant. So you're providing surplus food from businesses to people. Felix are providing food from businesses to organisations and small groups. And then Olio are providing food that's going, that surplus food basically from people to people. So I love already that we're capturing kind of all these different points actually where we could potentially be not just we could potentially be wasting food, but also where we could be sharing food as well. So brilliant. Thank you, Jany. Let's go to Emma. Emma, I think a lot of us know the Trussell Trust, or at least recognise the name from the amazing work that you do, but tell us a little bit about your work.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sophie, and really nice to be with everyone today. So I work for the Trussell Trust, and we're a charity with a vision of a future where there's no need for food banks. So we support a nationwide network of food banks to provide emergency support to people who don't have enough money for food. And we also campaign for change so that we can end the need for food banks in the future. There are more than 1,200 food bank centres in our network. So it's important to say that while lots of food banks are in our network, there are also loads of amazing food banks doing really vital work who aren't in our network as well. And yeah, essentially a whole range of different organisations are involved on the ground, kind of networked together to make sure that like people who have been hit by something, which means they don't have enough money for the basics, can then get emergency support.
Brilliant, thank you. I know that we have some people joining us today who are involved in other food banks that aren't necessarily part of the network. So just to say that they are also very welcome today. We're really pleased that you can join us. And finally, let's hear from our last participant, who's Chloe.
Hi, nice to meet everyone. So I'm Chloe Hall, and I co-founded Furloughed Foodies at the beginning of lockdown with a friend of mine, florist in Nairn House. I found myself furloughed at the beginning of April with not much to do. And actually a friend of mine asked me to cook some meals for some NHS workers. And then we kind of realised that probably lots of people are going to be furloughed during this time at the beginning of the pandemic. So we decided to set up a social media handle called Furloughed Foodies, and it kind of just snowballed. We had loads of people reach out to us asking to help us, and we ended up delivering to over 15 hospitals, and then through a network of about 500 volunteers. And then from the beginning of the pandemic, we then transitioned into supporting food banks and people that are homeless. So yeah, that's just a little bit of background about me and Furloughed Foodies.
Brilliant, thank you so much for joining us. So obviously one of the big issues that we want to talk about today is about food poverty and about access to food, sometimes also called food insecurity. So we're hearing a lot more about these this year, but these aren't new issues. Let's talk a little bit about how we got here. Emma, let's go to you first. Can you tell us a little bit about how we got to this situation and what are the sort of issues that people are facing?
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. So you're exactly right, essentially. Over the last 5 years, we've seen a 74% increase in people needing support from food banks in our network. So sort of historically speaking, food banks are like relatively new in the UK. There are food banks been running in the US for much longer, for example. But essentially, we've seen since kind of a growing number of food banks opening up around the time of the financial crash in 2008, still like relatively small numbers. And then around 2012 and 13, we just saw a really massive increase in essentially like people in their community being like, there are people nearby who can't afford food and I want to do something about it. And so we saw like a big spike in food banks opening during that period of time. Since about 2014, the number of food banks in our network has been pretty stable. But we've seen this 74% increase in people needing support. So kind of, yeah, a really big increase. And we've been doing quite a lot of research into looking into why people are needing help. So to just kind of give a bit of context of exactly like what does it mean to say that people don't have enough money for the basics. So we did a really big piece of research last year called State of Hunger, and essentially found that on average, people who are needing a food bank have a weekly income after housing costs of just £50. And when you look at what that means, there's money left to spend on. Essentially 94% of people are classed as destitute, which means that they don't have enough money for like the real essentials, so like food, shelter, energy, and like appropriate clothing. And we also see that nearly 75% of people have got at least like one health issue. So there's kind of like people are basically like in a position where they don't have any money left. There's no like flex in any budgets. And often like when you're in a food bank and you're chatting to someone, like people know exactly where like every last penny is gone because there's so little money. So having a look at sort of why people are being left with that little money. In this piece of research, we saw that 2/3 of people who were using a food bank in our network had a problem with the benefit system in the year before needing emergency food. So particularly with the rollout of universal credit and people having to wait at least 5 weeks for a first payment. Like, I don't know about you on the call, but I certainly couldn't last 5 weeks without any money coming in. And so kind of there are basically what our research is showing is that there are like these structural issues that have been like designed into systems, which mean that people aren't left with enough money. But that means that we can change those structures. Because we're really clear that like it's not right that anyone needs a food bank, but also we really know what we can change in order to make sure that people do have enough money. So yeah, that's, I don't want to ramble on, but that's a bit of an overview.
I think that's a really clear overview actually of exactly why people end up in that situation. Thank you. Jane, when Felix is providing food to groups and communities, is that often actually why they get in contact with you? Is it a financial issue that leads them to reach out to you?
Yes, we supply about 600 London charities, primary schools, and holiday play schemes and play clubs. And we have a waiting list. We've grown enormously during this year, which has been negative and positive. The need has grown enormously, but so has also the supply and also the support that we've got. So everything has been aligned for us to provide more to this need. And in London, there were about 400,000 children at risk of hunger, and that's gone up by 25%, at least during COVID. And we think adult food insecurity across the country has gone up fourfold. So in very practical terms, overnight, what was happening was these charities, who a large part of their work was to invite people in and give them either food parcels or hot meals, depending on what they did. So, but at a stroke, social kitchens had to close. People were then isolating and shielding and just couldn't get out to access food, even if they could get out, that they were finding food shortages in the first few weeks of the crisis. And there was a need for doorstep deliveries, and that's where we and all the local boroughs came together, and with other food redistribution charities. And then apart from that, some of the problems we've heard about, people losing their whole income overnight and having money just being really tight or just absent. So all those things came together during COVID.
That's a really good summary, actually, because I feel like when we look back to the spring and the start of COVID, I think I certainly saw a lot of people who literally could not get to the shops, and particularly the days where if you couldn't get out the house, if you were struggling for whatever reason, then you literally could not get to where food was. And then you combine that with the existing kind of poverty, the lack of money to get food. And now you can see the two kind of coming together, can't you? So people who are having, basically being financially very badly affected by the wider situation around COVID as well. And it's a bit of a double whammy. I was going to ask you all actually about what this looked like for you during the early stages of COVID, because that's what I saw. I was lucky enough to do some volunteering with a local community food service. But Chloe, perhaps we can talk to you about this, because obviously your work came about because you were furloughed during COVID. So what sort of things did you see at the start of COVID? How did it look for you?
What I would say is that when I was furloughed, I just wanted to do anything I could to help the community. We were all, I think, as a country and as a nation, we were all, really scared of the virus, and no one really knew what was next. So everyone kind of wanted to come together and help. And when we set up Furloughed Foodies, we literally just set up a website and we posted on our own personal social media channels. we were just so amazed by the amount of people that wanted to help. I mean, it was literally overnight we had, you know, about 300 people contact us wanting to help. So I think COVID has definitely brought out, you know, really good in people, and I think it's definitely brought communities together, and you know, so that's what I would say is my personal experience.
Thank you. Anyone want to add anything to that about what they saw at the start of lockdown? Jane, let's go to you.
Yes, well, so very dark days right at the beginning. We had huge anxiety. We didn't know if we would be able to continue operating because the virus was so new. We didn't know what our status would be. And it was a huge relief when we found out that we could be classed as key workers and ours was an essential service. And that then gave us a platform. We were very worried about fundraising. At the beginning of the year, we had a target of 1.8 million to raise. And so this came quite early on in the year. And there was a week where one by one, all of our fundraising events, which were our main channel to raise funds, just were cancelled one by one, like a pack of dominoes going down. So those were the lows. And then once we knew we could keep operating, we very quickly started coordinating in a brilliant way with the Mayor of London and the local boroughs, 32 boroughs. We agreed that we would get food in bulk to their hubs, and over just a couple of 2 or 3 weeks, the boroughs all set up at least one bulk food hub. And we roared into action, and we were inundated by volunteers. We were worried that, you know, we had lost quite a few volunteers because they themselves were shielding or had family members who were shielding, but our lifeblood is volunteers. And then we were inundated with fantastic people wanting to help us. And then we had a fundraising campaign through the Evening Standard. And to be honest, we were just overwhelmed. We were staggered by the amount of support and goodwill, and by how people so quickly recognized that this was a food crisis and moved into action. So by the end of this year, our fundraising is looking more like an achievement of 9+ million, which seems extraordinary now. I mean, looking back, we'd never have imagined that. And the amount of growth and profile it's driven has been fantastic. So highs and lows.
Yes, very much. And there's something you mentioned there that actually I'd love to pick up with you, Tessa, which is just the role of volunteers and the difficulties actually in sometimes getting people face to face that we're still, I was going to say facing, if you'll pardon the pun, because obviously your service is very much based around people sharing food with people around them. And did you ever find that was a difficulty when, you know, you're in COVID and it's people want to do good things and share things with the people around them, they want to help, but they're not sure if they can see people or be face to face? How did that work for you?
So similar to Jane, the first 24 hours of lockdown were an extremely tense time. It was deeply unclear whether a neighbour-to-neighbour food sharing app could continue to operate or not during such a difficult time. But we worked with our food safety lawyer, our environmental health officer, but most importantly, listened to our community. And we heard very, very clearly that we had a responsibility to make sure that we kept operating through lockdown, because there were so many people who were dependent upon Olio as a lifeline of not just food, but other essential items. And for them, being able to access food from a neighbour's doorstep was easier and arguably safer than perhaps going into a store or getting on public transport or travelling to go access food. And so we immediately switched our model to be a no contact pickup model. So essentially it means you just leave the item outside a few minutes before the person who's due to pick it up arrives. And what we saw was in the first 5 weeks of lockdown, we had more food shared on our platform than we had in the previous 5 years. And that was just amazing to see. And I think that was a result of people really starting to recognize the value of food, to fully internalize the fact that it is our life source, and therefore to throw it away is, you know, not only wrong, it's sort of doubly wrong when there was so much hunger and so much suffering sort of taking place in our own communities. And I think that's the whole point of the Olio solution, is that there are over 8 million people living in food poverty in the UK, and the vast majority of them are not getting help and they're not getting support. And so the sort of community-based solution really helps those people. and made a massive difference to so many people. And we launched a couple of campaigns during COVID. One was Cook for Kids and one was Cook for Carers, which was to galvanize our community to cook some spare meals and to make them available to families and care workers in their local communities. And we had over 30,000 meals given away in that way.
I think that's brilliant, actually. I think there's been so many, even the issues that we're talking about, I think almost brings back to me the number of things that families and communities have had to overcome this year. And it's really heartening to me to just go, actually, well, there are lots of people doing really positive things in their community who are going, well, actually, I can be a small part of a solution. Even when the problem is enormous, I can do something to make people's lives a little bit better.
Yeah.
Jany, I want to come to you because I think Tessa put it really well. Is actually she felt a sense of responsibility almost to keep this going, to step up. And it feels like actually there are lots of businesses as well that have felt the same way, that they have an obligation and an opportunity to step in some way. Have you seen that?
Yeah, I think just to echo some of the stuff that Tessa's just said there, it's really like on point and quite poignant, which is, during the pandemic, it really highlighted like our value and relationship we have with food, which is, food is our primary source of survival. We cannot develop, we cannot grow without it. So it makes absolutely no sense to be throwing it away. But it's also that social glue that does bring us together. And, whether it's through technology and platforms that are bringing people together via food, I think that's one of the things that the pandemic has really sort of demonstrated, which is, food is this incredible vehicle, which we not only need for our development, but it does bring people together and bring communities together. And that's, something we've also really seen through our platform as well, is how responsive our user base has been to wanting to help food businesses, but ensure that, food is something that isn't wasted because we value it so much.
I'm very glad that you raised that, because it's definitely been something that's been on my mind as well, is the way that food does bring us together. Those of you who have heard of in project communities before will know that we run an event every year called the Big Lunch, which is the annual Thanksgiving Day for neighbours and communities, and is very much based around the idea that food does bring us together in a way that very little else does. It's something that we all need to survive. It's a cultural exchange. It's an exchange of affection for other people. I personally would definitely class myself as both a foodie and a feeder. I've definitely struggled with the inability this year to have people around my dinner table and send them away with little doggy bags of food. So clearly I need to be looking at Olio, I think, and other ways of sharing that love a little bit more. Have any of the other panelists experienced this as a kind of the social isolation that comes from not being able to eat together? Jane, and then I'm wondering, Emma, if we could come to you.
Yes, absolutely. It's a really strong issue for us. When we founded the charity, we saw food was absolutely critical in just providing the basics of survival. But more than that, it was a way to combat social isolation. And we favoured right from the start charities who were cooking full hot meals from scratch, from fantastic fresh ingredients, and bringing people in to eat as a community. I think most people on this call just, we're missing, as you say, the privilege and honour we have of eating with other people, and some of the most disadvantaged people in our society just lack this. And it's, as well as a sort of nutritional lifeline, it's an absolute social lifeline. It brings companionship, dignity, friendship and support. And in providing free food for these charities, we also give them the opportunity to make their own funds go further and provide all the services and care that they do, whether it's for ex-offenders, ex-addicts, the homeless. They can use food as a tool to achieve their mission as well.
Emma, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I guess, yeah. I mean, all of this kind of conversation, I think, is really highlighting how much of a, how much emotion is wrapped up in sort of our relationships with food. And so I think, one of the things that we often find at food banks is people, understandably, feeling a lot of, kind of this shouldn't be me. Like I never thought this would be me. And so like I've definitely spoken to like parents in a food bank who've been like, oh, I've just been skipping meals for days because I didn't have enough money for food, but like this was the first time I couldn't feed my kids, which is why I'm here. And I think there's so I think there's like a big question around, like, particularly for us in food banks, essentially we, food bank volunteers will do like amazing work to try and make people feel as welcome and comfortable as possible, to try and tackle that kind of stigma that exists. Sort of pre-coronavirus, there's a really big emphasis in food banks on like welcoming people in, sitting down, having a cup of tea, having a chat, sort of giving people space to be just listened to. Obviously with social distancing and now lots of food banks doing deliveries, that's much more difficult to kind of facilitate. But I think that kind of root kind of issue is why for us essentially we work really hard with food banks, and we know that loads of food banks are doing incredible stuff to try and make going to a food bank as dignified an experience as possible. But I think we essentially think that you can't really get away from it is like a dignity issue if someone doesn't have enough money for food. And we don't think that like if you don't have enough money for food, like essentially you shouldn't need to turn to a charity for help because you don't have enough money for food. Like we can in the UK create an environment where everyone has enough money, and so that's really what we've just released our next sort of strategy for the next 5 years, and that's really focused on like how do we make sure that like dignity is at the heart of everything we're doing at the moment, but with that kind of long-term vision for like what's actually the most dignified thing is for everyone to have enough money so that they can get whatever food they'd like from sort of any location, and not need to come to a food bank because they don't have money for like something that is so kind of basic, and as we've sort of all reflected on, like has so much kind of emotional weight as well.
Brilliant. Thank you. I think one of there's such an injustice in not being able to afford food, which I think is so exacerbated when we then go on and talk about food waste. We sort of go, how can we be dealing with both of these things at the same time? How can we not manage to be doing either of these things in the way that we want? So I'd be really keen to hear from, I think Jany, perhaps this might be a good time to come to you as well. And basically love to hear from our panelists who are actually dealing with surplus food and managing to get it to people who need it. How is it that we end up with so much surplus food? How is this happening? Let's start with people who are picking it up from businesses, and then Tessa, I'd love to come to you and find out actually what surplus food looks like when we're dealing with it at home.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind jumping in there and just kicking things off. And I think it's useful just to frame like the scale and gravity of the issue of food waste. It's more than a third of food produced ends up being wasted, which is just absolutely shocking when we talk about that emotional connection to food and its importance for our own development and for bringing communities and people together. And this really has an effect across what I like to term as sort of the three really sort of big triggers. It's financial implications, it's social, and it's environmental. And food waste itself is something which is costing us a hell of a lot of money. We're spending around about $2 trillion on throwing food away. In the UK, it's around 20 billion. To put that into context, our annual police budget is around 2.5 billion. So we're spending nearly 8 times the amount on throwing food away than we are on public services, which this really doesn't sort of add up. We've been mentioning about food insecurity and all of that, and the fact that more than enough food being produced. That there is more than enough food being produced, yet there are people going to bed hungry. It really does highlight that food waste is the true injustice here. But also, we're in a climate crisis at the moment, and food waste, it's not just food production, but food waste is accounting for 8 to 10% of greenhouse gas emissions, which, to put that into context again, it means that if food waste was a country, it'd be the 3rd largest greenhouse gas emitter after the US and China, or the equivalent of taking 1 in 4 cars off the road. And the comparisons we have are, there's plentiful, but I guess the most important environmental message that I want to get across stems from the drawdown report, which was published earlier this year, essentially saying that if that fighting food waste is the #1 most immediate and most impactful solutions that we as individuals or as businesses can do to reverse the effects of climate change. Now that there is one of the most comprehensive climate change reports. So it really does, stress the importance of fighting food waste on those 3 levels. But, I think that's, the way in which we want to sort of frame this conversation, which is just throwing food waste is a huge, huge issue. The scale and gravity of it is mind-boggling. But it is through this sort of collaborative approach which we can systematically change our food system and ensure that food isn't going to waste.
I think you've really painted a picture there of just how big the problem is in a way that is amazing to me as someone. I would certainly consider myself relatively well informed, but that is an enormous amount of food. Where is it in the chain? Because you talk about food systems. So where is it in this enormous system that food is just leaking out, as it were? Is it between growing it and getting it into shops? Is it between shops and getting it into homes? Whereabouts is the issue?
So there's 2 sort of ways of looking at it, and you can look at food waste and food loss from the developing world, and food loss and food waste in the developed world, and they're sort of the reverse pictures. So in Western Europe, we're very lucky. We've got developed and mature supply chains which are relatively efficient. In the developing world, there are things like there's a lack of storage, refrigeration at scale. So a lot of produce is lost at that first part of the supply chain. Actually, in the UK and in Europe, it's we as consumers. I'm sure Tessa can give us some more insight into this. But most of the food waste, it's around 70% of food waste is occurring in the homes. So we as consumers are responsible for a huge amount of that food waste. There is a caveat to that, and at the moment, there is very little transparency to the amount of food waste that is happening at farm level. So that the scale of that issue can be could be magnified, but there is, as I say, a lack of transparency. So food waste is happening all across the supply chain, but a huge proportion of it is happening at the end of it.
So Tessa, that brings us very seamlessly onto what you do. How do we end up wasting so much food at home?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's mind-boggling the amount of food that we waste in our home, and it's really, really important to point out that it's in stark contrast to the amount of food that we waste in a retail store, because most people, when they think about food waste, the first place their brain goes is to their local supermarket, and they assume that must be where the problem is. But if you take WRAP, so that's the UK sort of industry that measures all of this, if you take their data for the UK, and if you take their best estimates of what is taking place at the farm gate, so you're looking at food waste end to end in the UK, half of it is in the home. And that's because the average UK family is throwing away about 20% of their weekly shop. It's worth over £700 sterling per family per year. Collectively adds up to £14 billion worth of perfectly good food going off to landfill. And that's in contrast to actually just 2% of all food waste takes place at a retail store level. We've got 8% hospitality and food service, 12% manufacturing, and about 28% sort of on the farm gate. So that massive environmental problem that Jany just outlined, we are half of that. And that could be incredibly depressing, but another way to think about it is it's incredibly exciting. Actually, it means that if we all just take our small actions, then we can make a difference. And I think part of the big challenge with food waste in the home and why it exists is because people think that they don't count. They think, well, what difference does it make if I just chuck these 2 brown bananas in the bin? It's just little old me. Well, there's 28 million other households taking that same action that week. And that's why every single day we have millions and millions of bananas and potatoes and tomatoes and anything you can name being thrown away because all those individual households are just taking that seemingly small decision. So it's an absolutely enormous problem. One thing I do also kind of want to touch on in relation to this panel is something that I think we have to be quite careful about is taking the food waste problem, which is enormous, and taking the hunger problem, which is enormous, and thinking that we can solve the two together and we can all skip off and live happily ever after. I'm glad to see I'm seeing lots of nodding heads on the panel, but the reality is, if I just take sort of from the food waste perspective, the food waste problem is so large that the hungry people can't eat their way through all of the surplus food that's generated. So hungry people is not the solution to food waste. And similarly, when you talk about food poverty, yes, surplus food can be incredibly helpful. It's a helpful sticking plaster, but the real solutions are proper living wage, a fit for purpose welfare state, proper mental health services, all that kind of stuff. And I think we have to be super careful, not just trying to tie a neat bow around these two issues and hope that they can solve each other.
That is very clearly and well put, and thank you for that. As I think it's I think what you addressed really well there, and something that Emma mentioned earlier, is that fundamentally these are problems with the current system and the current way in which we live, and that unfortunately there are ways that we can try and alleviate two problems by addressing them together, but fundamentally that does not solve the underlying problems that we are.
I mean, I laugh because if I had £1 for every time someone said to me, what about the homeless? Can't they eat all this food? And I'm just like, okay, we've got households throwing away £14 billion worth of food. And I think according to Crisis, we have about sort of 10,000 rough sleepers on any one night. I'm like, that math just doesn't stack up. And so actually what we've got to do is think about what can we do as communities to solve these problems.
There was one other thing I think that it also really comes across in what you're saying, which is, again, something that was mentioned earlier by one of the other panelists, which is about dignity as well, isn't it? And it's something that I think is often kind of tied up in that tension between we want to feed people, we want to try and solve problems around food waste, and whether we basically there is a huge stigma, I think, around giving something to someone either as an act of charity or something that could be seen as waste. And I'm guessing, again, that's something that you're quite familiar with. Are people?
Yeah, we're extremely mindful of that. I will never forget talking to a professor of food insecurity at UCL, and he recounted to me some research he'd been doing in Ireland, Northern Ireland, and he said that the Protestants would go 2 miles to the Catholic food bank and the Catholics would go 2 miles to the Protestant food bank because so great was their stigma. And I think the sector is doing amazing work to do their very best to counter that. But as Emma said, at the end of the day, it can be really quite hard trying to persuade people that, that what they're feeling isn't true. And so that's why we really believe that if we can strengthen local communities, then community just doesn't have that same sort of load of stigma attached to it.
Thank you. Chloe, I'm really interested to hear actually what this was like for you, because when you were furloughed, and Furloughed Foodies started out from providing food to key workers and to NHS workers. And I'm really interested to hear actually what kind of response you got from them. Were those workers people who were experiencing food poverty, or were they people who were just rushed off their feet? How did they experience that?
Yeah, so the reason why we set up Furloughed Foodies to begin with, it was basically a direct response to COVID at the beginning of the pandemic. And at the beginning, the NHS were overrun and many of the canteens at hospitals were shut, and it meant that doctors and nurses and NHS workers were in hospitals for 12 hours straight and couldn't get access to healthy food. So we originally set up to, feed our key workers with healthy, nutritious meals and hot meals as well. But then as time went on, the pressure from the NHS did ease in the middle of the summer. So we, our original mission was to help those affected most by the coronavirus. And at the beginning, we felt it was key workers and NHS workers. But as time went on, we thought we wanted to kind of pivot our operations and then start supporting food banks and people that were homeless. So that was kind of the transition, or the evolution, I would say, of Furloughed Foodies.
Thank you. And I think also I'm gonna end up coming back to you now as we unbelievably our conversation is wrapping up quite quickly, and so I'm gonna try and bring us to a close so we can open up some questions from the panel. To the panel. And I want to kind of finish by having a little bit of discussion about actually what are the small steps that people can take. Because I think actually there have been lots of really good examples actually of ways that people can make a difference, and the way that actually even when we're facing several enormous and systemic issues, there are small things that we can do that make a difference. And Chloe, you basically ended up kind of creating this role for yourself. So presumably you do feel that actually what people do makes an enormous difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I would say that, I just wanted to help at the beginning. And it was just, at the beginning, it was just a group of friends banding together and cooking some meals for some NHS workers that we knew. And then we realised that it just started getting bigger organically. And then we started reaching out to more hospitals and more people started reaching out to us. So I would just say, like, don't think, oh, little old me, like I can't do anything to help. Like who's going to want to who's going to listen to me, sort of thing. What I've learned from doing Furloughed Foodies is that anyone can make a difference. And what we started with was something really small that then ended up, still like very small in comparison to all these other panelists. But, we rallied 500 volunteers across London. We ended up raising about £30,000 and we delivered about 30,000 meals. So something that started out really small ended up being much bigger than we could have ever imagined. So I would just say go for it. That would be my advice to anyone that wants to start anything, to help this cause.
That's absolutely phenomenal. So firstly, well done to you. And let's hear from the rest of our panelists as well. Tessa, you already talked about actually you think that community is incredibly important actually in supporting people, making them feel that they can access support that's out there. What can people do that will help?
So sort of with my very biased Olio sort of hat on, I would really encourage everybody to try and address food waste in their own home. And in doing so, I'd like to share with them the 5 S's of reducing food waste in your home. So the first one is shop. Make sure that you shop with a list of your meals sort of planned out for the week. It sounds boring, but it's highly effective. Second one is store your food properly. There are a ton of food storage hacks. Tomatoes belong on the counter and not in the fridge. Onions and potatoes should never be stored together, etc., etc. The list goes on. There's hundreds of them. Google them. So shop to a list, store properly, serve sensible portion sizes, and a super easy hack for that is just get smaller plates. Save your leftovers. It's amazing how good food tastes a couple of days later, actually, once it's marinated some more. And the final S is share your spare with a neighbour instead of throwing it away.
Thank you. Let's sum up by going back to our other panelists. It's Emma, Jamie, and Jane is somewhere on my screen but has disappeared just from the top. Is there anything else you want to encourage people to do? How can people make a difference? Emma?
Yeah, we'd love people to get involved. Essentially, sort of as a top line kind of figure, we've seen food banks giving out 2,600 parcels every day to children in the first 6 months of the pandemic. And we know that that's not right, but we also know that if we act together, that we can change this. And there are loads of different ways to get involved. So it could be about like having a conversation with a friend about why people are needing food banks, through to like signing a petition about like changing something to do with the benefit system, or it could be about donating to your local food bank. So one of the things that we've done in just the last few weeks is launch our new campaign for a hunger-free future. And if you sign up to the Hunger-Free Future campaign, then throughout the coming weeks, you'll be given loads of different options of ways that you could get involved. And so there's really something in there for everyone, kind of whatever you're able to do, whatever you're interested in doing. There's definitely, something that everyone can get involved in. So I'd really encourage you to go and have a look on the Trussell Trust website and click through to Hunger-Free Future.
Brilliant. Thank you all so much. I'm actually just looking through the questions that we have been sent. We have an enormous number of questions, and I sincerely doubt that we're going to be able to get through them all, but we will try and get through as many as we can before we wrap up. We have a question actually from someone who runs a local village shop. They want to know how they can reduce the wastage of food that's not sold before its use by date. So food basically that has got to a point where it's just by the use by date, it's not been sold. What can they do with that? Is there any way that food can be redistributed? And they particularly ask what are the legalities around that? Tessa?
Sure.
Or let's go to Jamie and then Tessa.
Go, Jamie.
Yeah, I don't mind jumping in there. So, you know, what I would encourage them to do if they're looking for sort of commercial solutions to recover some of those sunk costs. You know, shamelessly, I'll plug Too Good To Go. It's a platform which will allow you to redistribute that food via our platform to our user base, and you can recover some sunk costs from that. In terms of the legalities around date labeling, this is a topic which is super close to our heart. We've run several campaigns across Europe on what date labels mean, and it is a incredibly confusing topic. I mean, 50% of the British public don't know the difference between a use by or a best before. You know, 10% of all the food waste across Europe, so 8.8 million tons of food each year is wasted because of this confusion around date labels. So it is, you know, best before is a quality guidance metric, whereas used by is a safety metric. Food can be redistributed and sold after its best before. It just means that its quality is at its optimal sort of quality, as I say, before that date. So if you do have food on a use by date, you have to sell it legally before its use by date. But with best befores, you can redistribute or sell it anytime after that date.
And I'd love to just build on that with another shameless plug, which is if you haven't been able to sell the food for a price, then Olio has our Food Waste Heroes program. So we have over 10,000 volunteers across the country who are trained to be able to collect unsold food at the end of the day. They take it home, they add it to the app. Within minutes, the neighbours are requesting it. Minutes later, they're popping around and picking it up. And it works incredibly well for very short dated stock. So we're often redistributing stuff on the day of the use by date, because half of all the food added to the app is requested within 24 minutes. So it's a kind of a hyper local sort of redistribution model.
That's a great solution. Thank you. We have a question about the impact of COVID on food banks and people coming to food banks. How can we, since COVID, it's been really hard basically to engage with people while they're at the food bank, which I think is something that you mentioned earlier, Emma, that people are much more in and out, it's much more socially distant. And it means that actually we lose opportunities to not just provide conversation, but also to signpost to other kinds of support. So do you or any of the other panelists have any good examples of how projects are dealing with that, how we respond to that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's definitely an issue that loads of different community groups are facing this year. Different food banks are responding to it in different ways. So there are some food banks where particularly if they've got a big volunteer base who aren't necessarily able to leave home at the moment, but do want to do something from where they are. Some food banks have started doing things like dropping little slips in parcels that are being delivered, which say, if you want to have a chat with someone, or like, we'd love to chat to you about other support that's available locally, then like just text this number with a time that you're ready to chat and someone will give you a call back, so that volunteers can then do that signposting service to other local charities who could help address why someone doesn't have enough money, and then do that sort of from home. And then we're also, so there are like a couple of different kind of local initiatives like that happening in different places. And then we're also exploring at a national level how we can partner with bigger kind of national advice partners to bring that advice together and link it up with people locally. So yeah, I think it is a real challenge. And it's definitely, like, I think just generally this year, there's been just like incredible responses from communities to like get involved and do something proactively and really change the way that they work. So I think it's definitely something that people are really keen to sort of plug that gap. But yeah, I think it is an important question.
Brilliant. And I think we've got time for one more very quick question. So let's see, one more quick question. Yes, I think this is a very timely question. We're seeing lots of really great examples of how organizations and groups are utilizing digital technology, particularly in COVID. I know Olio's an app. I think Too Good To Go also is based around an app. How do we make sure that that doesn't mean that people fall through the gaps, that we make sure that actually we're reaching people who may not necessarily be that digitally inclined, be really keen to hear from any suggestions from the panel.
I'm happy to go quickly on how we've addressed that. So we have a web-based version of Olio, so you just need an internet connection. I think it is also worth stressing 95% of people in the UK do have a mobile phone, and the vast majority of those are smartphones. But for anyone who doesn't, they can access the app via the web.
Brilliant. And I'm afraid, I'm sorry, Jamie, I think we're actually going to have to leave it there because we are running out of time.
No problem.
I'm very sorry to have to cut you off. I'm just going to offer an enormous thank you to all of our speakers for joining us today. Thank you to Tessa from Olio, Jane from the Felix Project, Emma from Trussell Trust, Jamie from Too Good To Go, and Chloe from Furloughed Foodies. We're incredibly grateful to all of you for joining us today and sharing your expertise and your insight. One of my colleagues is going to be popping a little link to a survey in the chat. It really does only take 1 or 2 minutes, and we would be really interested to hear what you thought of the session, what you liked, what you would want to see done differently. So please do tell us, because we read it and it makes a big difference. The Festival of Discovery is going to be running for the rest of the day and all through Saturday as well. And we have lots of other really great sessions coming up. We're going to be running a session tomorrow, which is a cook along if you are like me, food inclined, which is going to be run by Kitchen Cultures, and we're very much looking forward to that. I'm also running a session this afternoon on LGBT inclusion in community life, and we're going to have lots of community focused sessions throughout the next 2 days as well. If you have enjoyed your experience today, obviously the entire Festival of Discovery is free. And we're very grateful to be funded by the National Lottery. But there is a link that you can follow if you'd like to make a small donation to support our work. There is absolutely no pressure, but we are extremely grateful if you choose to support us in that way. So all the links will be coming up in the chat just now. And all that remains for me to say is thank you very much to all of you, and enjoy the rest of your day. And we hope to see you very, very soon. Thanks, everyone.